Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast. Episode 2.2, Prelude to the Battle of Bautzen. As I explained in the previous episode, the Battle of Bautzen took place within the context of the wider Soviet attack on Berlin, called Operation Berlin. And in order to fully comprehend just why Bautzen found itself caught up in the fighting, you need to understand the objectives and goals of the Soviets in their final assault on Nazi Germany. Now, before I outline the goals and objectives of Operation Berlin, I just want to give you a heads up that I've posted a link to a map in the description of this episode, which will help you to follow along and visualize the positions of the various armies and the Red Army offensives in April 1945. So if you get lost at all, feel free to check the map. So by mid-April 1945, the Soviets had assembled 3 separate fronts along the Oder and Neisse rivers for the assault on Berlin, and these fronts comprised literally millions of men and thousands of tanks, planes and guns. Such was the overwhelming amount of manpower and firepower which had been assembled here, the Soviets could afford to give these fronts many primary and secondary objectives, not all of which were strictly related to the assault on Berlin itself. As a result, some of those secondary objectives would lead to the Red Army striking into Saxony, and perhaps nowhere in Saxony would be scarred more by the subsequent fighting than the small city of Bautzen. So what were the different objectives which were assigned to the varying Soviet fronts taking part in Operation Berlin? First up, you had Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, which was given the objective of attacking Berlin directly from their River Oder bridgeheads east of the capital. Next, you had Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, who were tasked with securing the northern approaches to Berlin. And finally, Marshal Konyev's First Ukrainian Front, positioned along the River Neisse to the south, was given the task of securing the southern approaches to Berlin. To tell the story of the Battle of Bautzen, we have to look more closely at the objectives given to Konyev's First Ukrainian Front, as it was armies belonging to this front which ended up trying to capture Bautzen. When outlining his orders for the First Ukrainian Front, Stalin practically gave Konyev a shopping list of varying objectives which his forces were expected to achieve. They were expected to A. Secure the southern flank of the overall Soviet advance on Berlin and prevent its disruption by Wehrmacht forces coming from the south. B. Support the assault on Berlin itself by attacking the city from the south. C. Advance deep into German territory and link up with the Americans who were rapidly advancing from the west. And last but not least, D. Konyev's forces were also ordered to capture Dresden. Dresden, despite having been reduced to rubble by the Allied bombing raids of February 1945, still represented an attractive prize for the Soviets, given its status as the capital of Saxony and its reputation as the Florence on the Elbe. Dresden was also destined to become an important city in the post-war Soviet occupation zone. Now, all of those objectives were valuable in either a military or political sense, but in order to fulfill them all at the same time, Konyev had to split his forces into 2 separate offensives. His right flank was given the responsibility of securing the southern approaches to Berlin before joining the assault on the capital. This was known as the Cottbus-Potsdam offensive. And if you want to hear more about that, then check out my series on the Halber Pocket, where this story is told in more detail. Konyev's left flank, meanwhile, was tasked with driving a wedge between the Germans stationed across the River Neisse, preventing Wehrmacht forces in central and southern Germany from coming to the assistance of Berlin. This left flank also had the tasks of linking up with the Americans and capturing Dresden. And this left flank offensive was known as the Spremberg-Torgau offensive. For this series, the Red Army forces which operated at the extreme southern edge of this Spremberg-Torgau offensive are of the most interest to us, as it's these forces who launched the invasion of Saxony and who also carry out the eventual assault on Bautzen. But if the ultimate goal in Saxony was to capture Dresden, why did a battle take place in Bautzen? Well, simply put, coming from the east, Bautzen lies directly on the Autobahn 4 highway to Dresden. Therefore, the quick capture of Bautzen was made a key objective which could then provide a springboard to the subsequent capture of Dresden. The assault on Saxony and the specific drive towards Bautzen and Dresden was called Operation Lausitz, named after the region Bautzen is located in. And just like with the main thrusts on Berlin to the north, the attack here on the southern end of the River Neisse line was also scheduled to start at 4 a.m. Berlin time on the 16th of April. The Soviets weren't expecting the Germans to put up a stiff resistance in this sector of the line. So whilst the goals for Operation Lausitz were ambitious, they were still deemed plausible objectives nonetheless. To begin with, they were to cross the River Neisse and quickly overrun the German defences between the towns of Bad Muskau and Rothenburg. Once through the forward German defences, the attack could then proceed into Saxony. In this drive, key German towns such as Niesky, which was 15 kilometers behind the front line, were expected to be taken by the end of the first day of operations. And by the second day, the Red Army was expected to have reached the town of Weissenberg, roughly halfway to Bautzen. By the third day, the Soviets expected Bautzen to have already fallen to their forces, enabling the city to be used as a launch pad for the final drive towards Dresden. The hope was that in reaching Bautzen in just 3 days, a wedge would have been driven between German Army Group Vistula, operating in Brandenburg, and the German Army Group Center, concentrated in Saxony. With these German forces successfully split in two, strong Soviet defensive positions could then be established, preventing any counterattack from Army Group Center forces around Görlitz in Saxony, which might threaten to break through the Soviet lines, strike north, and disrupt the rest of the First Ukrainian Front's march on Berlin. As I said, this plan was extremely ambitious, and it was premised on many flaky assumptions. Firstly, the Soviet High Command believed the strength of the German forces in the area to be weak, demoralized, understrength, and lacking the necessary fuel and ammunition to put up an effective resistance. Secondly, the Soviets believed that the 100-kilometer distance from the starting positions of their attack to the final objective of Dresden could be traversed quickly by an armoured vanguard making use of the efficient German road system. And thirdly, the Soviets believed the plan would surely succeed given the superior fighting quality and experience of the brave Red Army forces carrying out the offensive. As we'll find out during the series, most of these assumptions were completely wide of the mark. But perhaps the biggest mistake in the Soviet planning was to believe that the forces they had chosen to carry out the assault into Saxony had the necessary level of experience, resources, and tactical acumen to pull it off. It's therefore time to meet the armies tasked with this ambitious undertaking. Operating on the extreme southern flank of the Spremberg-Torgau offensive was the Polish Second Army, led by General Karol Szyszewski. On the Polish right flank was the Soviet 52nd Army, led by General Konstantin Korytayev, and on their left flank, the Poles were covered by the Soviet 5th Guards Army. Under the auspices of Operation Lausitz, however, it was the Soviet 52nd Army and the Polish Second Army who were responsible for smashing through the German defences along the River Neisse between the towns of Bad Muskau and Rothenburg. It was also these two armies who were given the objective of capturing Bautzen and Dresden. So when discussing the Polish-Soviet actions over the rest of the series, I'll be focusing on those two armies in particular. Given that the campaign to capture Bautzen and Dresden was seen as a secondary operation, it was perhaps inevitable that the number and quality of troops designated for this campaign matched their secondary front status. After all, the most experienced and best equipped forces the Red Army could field at the time were being utilized for the main drive on Berlin. Moreover, the drive on the capital was also being prioritized when it came to the supply of tanks, vehicles, and aerial support. The Polish-Soviet forces assembling along the banks of the River Neisse, however, preparing to strike into Saxony, were a curious mix of experience and inexperience, and the quality and amount of equipment and vehicles they were given also varied wildly. On the one hand, the Soviet 52nd Army had a long history of fighting on the Eastern Front, and thus could count many battle-hardened veterans amongst its numbers. This army was experienced, and it had fought numerous battles against the Germans in Silesia throughout the early months of 1945. Nevertheless, those engagements with the Germans had slowly bled the 52nd Army dry, and by April 1945, its ranks of fighting men had shrunk so much that it could only muster 20,000 men, far short of what it should have had. The armoured unit within the 52nd Army was the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps, led by General Korchagin, which was supported by the 254th and 294th Rifle Divisions. These units, working in unison, were to act as the vanguard of the Soviet thrust into Saxony, and they will play a key role in the upcoming fighting in and around Bautzen. However, the 7th Guard Mechanized Corps, much like the 52nd Army overall, was plagued by a lack of manpower and firepower, and on the eve of the River Nysa crossings, it counted only 11,000 men in its ranks, and possessed only 150 armoured vehicles of all types. But it was the lack of tanks in particular which would eventually cause major problems for the unit when engaging the Germans later on in our story. The Polish Second Army, on the other hand, was remarkably well equipped, given that it had up to 90,000 men in its ranks and over 400 tanks and armoured vehicles. These weren't just run-of-the-mill tanks either, as they included the latest models of T-34 tanks. But, whilst the Poles had a full complement of men and hardware, it had other major flaws which heavily influenced its performance in the upcoming fighting. In order to convey the issues the Polish Second Army faced, we first need to understand the origins of this Polish army. So ever since the Soviets had regained the initiative against the Germans in the summer of 1943, the war became less of an existential threat to the survival of the Soviet Union, but rather a tool which could be utilized to reshape the post-war political and territorial map of Eastern Europe in the Soviet Union's favor. And one way the Soviets actively used the war to help bind Poland into the Soviet sphere was to create the Polish People's Army. The Polish People's Army, created in 1943 and led by General Berling, was marketed as an independent fighting force led and staffed by Poles. This army was to fight alongside their Soviet allies in order to liberate all Polish-occupied territories still held by the Germans, and ultimately, the Poles were to help the Soviets defeat Nazi Germany once and for all. However, it would not be fighting for the establishment of an independent, free and democratic post-war Poland. Instead, the Polish People's Army was firmly under Soviet and Polish communist control, and it was intended to act as a post-war counterweight to the Polish Underground Home Army and to the Polish units fighting in the Western Allied armies, both of which were loyal to the non-communist Polish government in exile stationed in London. Eventually, the Polish People's Army would see two armies actually deployed in the field: the Polish First Army and the Polish Second Army, and these two armies fought with the Soviets in 1944 and 1945. The Polish First Army, as the name suggests, was the first army to be created, and it was already actively fighting on the front line by the summer of 1944. The Polish Second Army, however, was created only in October 1944, and it didn't see any action until April 1945. In both cases, the infantry of the two Polish armies actually consisted of Polish nationals. Ironically, however, many of those Polish soldiers had originally been taken as prisoners of war by the Soviets in 1939 when they invaded Poland in collaboration with Nazi Germany. Another source of Polish troops came from the parts of Poland which were, quote-unquote, liberated by the Soviets as they passed through the country again in 1944 and 1945. In these newly freed territories, the Soviets would recruit heavily from the liberated Polish population, and new conscripts were then placed in the newly created Polish armies. However, whilst there were enough Polish recruits to fill the ranks of the infantry in these new armies, these troops lacked any fighting experience. But the real problem with these newly created Polish armies was with the officer corps, because here the Soviets struggled to find enough experienced Polish officers to serve in the Polish First and Second Armies. And this was down to many reasons. Firstly, many of the best and brightest of the pre-war Polish officer class had been murdered by the Soviets in the Katyn massacre in 1940. Secondly, many of the remaining Polish officers who weren't targeted in the massacre fled the country to fight in the Western Allied forces instead. Thirdly, most of the officers who did remain in occupied Poland joined the underground Polish Home Army, which, as I said, was loyal to the Polish government in exile, so those officers couldn't be trusted by the Soviets. And lastly, some Polish officers were still sitting in German POW camps. As a result, there weren't enough Polish officers left in Poland in 1944 and 1945, and there certainly weren't many experienced ones left. But those crafty Soviets came up with a couple of ingenious solutions to this problem, of course. So firstly, some of the Polish conscripts from the newly liberated territories were hurriedly rushed into training programs to help shape them into competent officers. The snag here was that many of these new recruits were poorly educated, and they had little or no combat experience, and they definitely had no experience leading men in the field under fire. Secondly, the Soviets also resorted to simply filling the officer corps in these new Polish armies with their own officers from the Red Army. Now, in doing this, the Soviets tried to transfer officers of supposed Polish origin, but often this just meant finding Russian officers who had dubious or distant Polish ancestry. And additionally, their command of the Polish language, if they had any at all, was poor. In any case, eventually half of the officers in the Polish Second Army would be Russian-Soviet transfers from the Red Army. And the higher up the chain of command you went, the fewer and fewer Polish officers you met. All of these problems were already an issue with the creation of the Polish First Army, but as you can imagine, by the time the Polish Second Army came around, these problems had only gotten worse. So, due to the lack of experience in both the infantry and officer corps of the Polish Second Army, and due to the influx of Russian or Soviet officers into the senior command ranks, morale was extremely low in the Polish Second Army, and there was not a lot of love lost between the Russian officers and the Polish infantry. One last problem the Polish Second Army had to cope with, and perhaps this was its biggest problem overall, was its general. At the head of the Polish Second Army was General Karol Szyszewski, who, despite being Polish-born, was a long-time Soviet loyalist who had even served in the Red Army against Poland in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. He had then gone on to compounded loyalty to the communist cause by serving with the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. And it was likely these two factors which kept him out of the firing line during the Katyn massacre. Szyszewski was seen by the Polish rank and file, quite rightly, as being a Soviet stooge, and coupled with his chronic alcoholism and contempt for the lives of the soldiers serving under him, the infantry had little trust in him or loyalty to him. But Szyszewski had won his position due to his loyalty to Stalin, and that counted more than his lack of talent and lack of leadership qualities. Nevertheless, his conduct and bizarre decisions caused a lot of problems for the Polish Second Army later in the fighting, and ultimately, his actions would cost thousands of Polish lives. As I said before, the Polish Second Army was only created in October 1944, so Operation Lausitz would in fact be this army's baptism of fire. And it would prove to be a bloody baptism of fire, as the Polish Second Army was going to be used as a battering ram to open up the German defences along the River Neisse, subsequently allowing the Soviet 52nd Army, led by the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps, to follow through and plunge into Saxony. Despite the fighting quality of the Polish and Soviet troops carrying out Operation Lausitz being mixed, Marshal Konev was confident that these armies had the men, material, and motivation to fulfill the objectives they had been given. The operation in Saxony was thus seen as a formality, and the Soviets expected Weissenberg, Bautzen, and even Dresden to fall into their hands in a matter of days. But there was one group who had a vote in deciding whether Operation Lausitz would be a cakewalk or not, and that, obviously, was the Germans. So let's review the German units tasked with defending this section of the line. Facing the first Ukrainian front across the River Neisse were the forces of the German Army Group Center, led by Ferdinand Schöner. At this stage of the war, Army Group Center consisted of the 4th Panzer Army under Hubert Gräse and the 17th Army under Wilhelm Hasse. However, the defense of East Saxony would primarily fall to Gräse's 4th Panzer Army. The key units from this army, who will feature heavily in the series, are the 20th Panzer Division, led by Major General Hermann von Oppoln-Bronickowski, the Fallschirm Panzer Division 1, Hermann Göring, led by Major General Max Lemke, which from now on I'll refer to as the 1st Hermann Göring Division for short, and the Mechanized Panzer Grenadier Division, Brandenburg, led by Major General Hermann Schulte-Heuthaus. Of course, there were other units attached to the 4th Panzer Army as well, such as the Kohlsdorfer Battle Group, the Moser Corps, and the 17th and 72nd Infantry Divisions. But whilst these units are involved in the fighting in East Saxony, particularly along the River Neisse, they feature less prominently in the later fighting around Bautzen, which will be the main focus of our series. In any case, on the eve of the Polish-Soviet assault on Saxony, the combined German forces in the area totaled 50,000 soldiers, 300 tanks, and 600 guns. In terms of manpower, this put the Germans at a 2-to-1 disadvantage compared to the Soviet and Polish forces they would be facing. Nevertheless, on paper, the Germans had assembled an impressive array of men and equipment to defend Eastern Saxony, and the number of tanks available to the German forces in this sector actually outnumbered the number of tanks which had been set aside for the defense of Berlin. However, as with all descriptions of the Wehrmacht in April 1945, what the Germans could produce in terms of vehicles and guns was offset by the desperate lack of fuel and ammunition available to their forces. Plus, after spending months retreating through Silesia in the wake of the most recent Red Army advances, the German infantry had been reduced both in terms of numbers and experience. Infantry divisions suffered from a lack of experienced fighting men, and the Wehrmacht's panicked tactics of filling the gaps in the ranks with Luftwaffe ground crews, Hitler Youth teenagers, and elderly members of the Volkssturm provided only a temporary sticking plaster designed to give the appearance of fully fledged armies. Once the shit hit the fan and the Poles and Soviets attacked, these raw recruits had an unenviable task ahead of them. That said, most of the German troops had seen some combat before, and some troops had seen literally years of combat. This gave them an advantage over their opponents, particularly over the inexperienced Poles. Moreover, the presence of elite, armoured or mechanized divisions, such as the 1st Hermann Göring Division or the Brandenburg Division, provided the 4th Panzer Army forces with a strong, armoured and mobile spine, which could move around quickly on the battlefield, exploiting any weaknesses in their opponent's lines. The last trick up the sleeve the Germans could call on was the Luftwaffe, which, given this is April 1945 we're talking about, is a shocking fact in and of itself. Of course, by now, the Luftwaffe had almost run out of experienced pilots, and due to Germany's diminishing fuel reserves, the Luftwaffe had to severely limit the number of sorties it could even launch. Thus, on the battlefield, appearances by the Luftwaffe were becoming increasingly rare, and their effectiveness when they did make an appearance was also reduced due to the overwhelming number of Soviet planes which by now had established air supremacy over the front line. However, the Red Army's decision to designate the drive onto Bautzen and Dresden as a secondary front, compared to the main assault on Berlin, meant that relatively few Red Army Air Force planes were assigned to support the Soviet and Polish armies in this area. As a result, the Germans were able to utilize the precious few Luftwaffe fighter planes and bombers they had left to great effect. This enabled the Luftwaffe to provide close aerial support of German ground forces, and they had an almost free hand to launch attacks on Soviet and Polish armoured vehicles. The Luftwaffe was also helped by the fact that the fighting in Saxony took place in open countryside, where there was a minimal amount of tree cover for the Soviet and Polish forces to hide under. So to conclude, whilst the Soviet and Polish forces enjoyed a numerical advantage in terms of manpower and firepower, the relative inexperience of their own forces, coupled with a lack of Red Army Air Force support, and the difficulty of reaching the faraway target of Dresden within the quick timetable they had planned, meant that the upcoming offensive would be extremely difficult for the Polish-Soviet armies to pull off. Plus, the greater experience of the German troops facing them, coupled with the fact that as defenders, the Germans didn't need so many troops in the first place, meant that all things considered, it was pretty much a fair fight between the Germans and their Soviet-Polish opponents. So just how did the Germans plan to repel the Red Army's assault into Saxony? Before I outline the German defense plan, just an FYI, I'm about to throw some more town names at you, so please go check out the map linked in the episode description so you can follow along and understand the geography of the battle more easily. In the days leading up to the Soviet and Polish assault, 4th Panzer Army was positioned as follows. In the south, near Görlitz, there was the 1st Hermann Göring Division and the 20th Panzer Division, supported by the 72nd Infantry Division. In the north, near the town of Rietchen, were the 464th, 545th, and 615th Divisions, drawn mainly from the Kohlsdorfer Battle Group and the Moser Corps. And in the centre, around the town of Rothenburg, stood the well-equipped and elite Panzer Grenadier Division Brandenburg. The German leadership expected the main Red Army attack to come through the centre, hence why they had placed the elite Brandenburg Division there to absorb the main blow. The Brandenburg Division, with their 11,500 men, held a 20-kilometre section of the line, and their orders were to defend that line and slow the Soviet advance long enough to allow German forces stationed in Görlitz to attack the flanks of the attacking Soviets. To help frustrate the advance of the Red Army, 3 defence lines had been created behind the Brandenburg Division's forward positions, allowing them to fall back, if need be, to multiple prepared lines of defences. If this first set of defensive lines along the River Neisse failed, then Army Group Centre's backup plan had seen the establishment of further defence lines along the Weisse and Schwarze Schurps rivers. And lastly, if those defences were also overcome, then fortified towns along the route towards Dresden, most notably Weissenberg and Bautzen, were to become the next line of defence, to be held at all costs. So as we can see, the last piece of the puzzle in the German defence plan for Saxony were the towns and cities themselves. This is therefore the perfect time to shift our focus to Bautzen, to see how the city was affected by the war approaching its doorstep in 1945, and how subsequently defences were established to turn the city into a strong fortress which would not fall. As a result of the successful Vistula Order offensive by the Red Army in January and February 1945, millions of German refugees, particularly from Silesia, were forced to flee their homes and seek safety further west. Saxony was often their first port of call, and it's estimated that between January and March 1945 alone, more than 3 million refugees passed through the city of Bautzen. To cope with the massive influx of people, 21 reception centres were established throughout the city, including in the museum and in cinemas and churches. These centres could hold up to 330,000 people at any time. As Bautzen now found itself so close to the front line, the German High Command scrambled to prepare the city for the inevitable Soviet onslaught. And in mid-February, prisoners of war and inmates from a subcamp of the Gross-Rosen concentration camp were forced to build trenches and tank barriers around the outskirts of Bautzen. The authorities soon realized, however, that even with the use of concentration camp inmates and prisoners, the defenses wouldn't be ready in time. So in late February, the civilian population of Bautzen, including any refugees who were staying there at the time, were given shovels and were ordered to build further fortifications in and around the city. As local resident Willy Mendel recounts from the time, a stream of refugees flooded through the city from the east. Whole villages travelled through on horse and cart. Sometimes it was a stud farm with magnificent horses. Sometimes it was entire offices and departments making their way west together. but groups of prisoners from concentration camps also passed through under strict guard, and the sight of Jewish women being chased through was gruesome. Despite the cold season, they were very poorly clothed, and many were barefoot. Overnight refugee camps were set up in the city, and food was also provided. But the next morning, they had to move on, because a new stream of refugees arrived, and there was no end to it. Foxholes were set up everywhere. The often quite primitive anti-tank barriers could only have held back the advance of the Soviet troops for hours. On the other hand, these barriers were an obstacle for the fleeing people, who could only get their handcarts over them with difficulty. The Bautzen authorities intended to turn their city into a fortress capable of holding out against Soviet forces. And ironically, the impressive medieval walls Bautzen possessed became an integral part of those defense plans. For instance, the Altenburg Castle, which sits atop a rocky hill in the center of Bautzen, was turned into the headquarters of the city garrison, and it would be from this castle that the defense of Bautzen would be conducted in late April. But as grandiose as those city walls were, they faced westwards, which was of little help when the impending attack would surely come from the east. In any case, the walls would be no match for modern Soviet artillery, so Bautzen's best hope for defense lay in the construction of defenses outside of the city and on the main access points into the city center. These defense positions consisted of multiple lines of trenches and anti-tank barriers, and it was hoped they would become insurmountable choke points which the Red Army would find difficult to overcome, thereby slowing down their advance and ensuring Bautzen could hold out for as long as possible. In short, if the Red Army could be tied down in street fighting and house-to-house combat in Bautzen, then this would delay their overall advance onto Dresden. Alongside the physical preparations which were made for the defense of Bautzen, the authorities also went to extreme measures to enforce military discipline among the troops stationed in and around the city, with over a dozen Wehrmacht soldiers sentenced to death for cowardice and dereliction of duty in March and April alone. Plus, the people of Bautzen were subjected to increasingly desperate levels of Nazi propaganda, which warned them of the brutal treatment they could expect to face from a victorious Red Army. This Nazi propaganda produced two outcomes. On the one hand, the people were successfully convinced that they were unlikely to be granted any mercy by the Russians. This therefore stiffened their resolve and encouraged many soldiers and even civilians to fight to the last bullet. On the other hand, the warnings of impending death and destruction at the hands of the Russians also drove many people to suicide. In terms of forces stationed within Bautzen for the defense of the city, Bautzen had been fortified with a garrison of 3,000 men, drawn primarily from 2 defense battalions and 2 Volkssturm battalions. These 2 Volkssturm units were predominantly composed of men over the age of 60 and teenagers under the age of 16, so the average age was around about 47. In most cases, the Volkssturm units were completely under-equipped for the upcoming fighting, with most being given captured French rifles with between only 5 to 25 rounds each. To bolster the defense of Bautzen, a few dozen policemen and 70 Hitler Youth boys had also been called up to fight. Alongside their antiquated rifles and measly amounts of ammunition, however, the defenders of Bautzen were also issued grenades and Panzerfausts, which would prove invaluable in the later street fighting. In terms of artillery, the Bautzen garrison relied on the anti-aircraft battery stationed on the hills along the eastern approaches to the city. Here, at Burg, Schafberg, Rabitz, and Neupurschwitz, flak guns, including a dozen 88mm guns and a 37mm gun, had been positioned, and these could be called into action to shell the approaching Soviets. The effectiveness of these batteries against heavy armoured tanks was questionable, but they could at least slow down the approach of infantry and conventional vehicles. However, again, This advantage was offset by the fact that these artillery positions were manned not by experienced flak operators, but rather Hitler Youth boys who lacked the correct training. Once the main Polish-Soviet attack began, there were numerous ragtag elements of Wehrmacht soldiers who also found themselves trapped in Bautzen, cut off from their main units. Given no choice but to fight or die, these soldiers joined in the fight to defend the city. Moreover, a few hundred men of the 10th SS Frundsberg Division, best known for fighting the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, also found themselves trapped in Bautzen during the fighting. And who was in charge of the defense of Bautzen? Well, that would be Oberst Dietrich Höpke. Höpke was a former tactics instructor at the Dresden War College, and during the war he had fought on the Eastern Front. He was invalided out of the German army, however, after suffering a serious knee injury, and it was only after the bombing of Dresden in February 1945 that Höpke voluntarily returned to service in order to assist in the defense of Germany. He was subsequently assigned commander of the Bautzen garrison, and he based himself at the garrison headquarters in the Ortenburg Castle. By all accounts, Höpke took his duty seriously, and unlike senior Nazi Party officials who had later escaped from Bautzen rather than stay and fight, Höpke was determined to defend Bautzen to the last man, and he pursued the defense of the city with a maniacal zeal. But of course, this being Nazi Germany, this zeal was backed up by a ruthless evil streak, and Höpke's name would feature on many death sentences which were carried out during the fighting of both Soviet and German soldiers. So to conclude today's episode, the forces which will face off against each other in our story have been introduced. The defensive plan for Bautzen has been outlined, and the feasibility of the overall Polish-Soviet attack plan and the fragile nature of that plan has also been laid out. Time for the battle to begin.